Late autumn, 1883. Montana Territory, just south of the Bitterroot Valley. A lone cabin sits on a hillside, smoke rising thin and straight from its chimney. Below the cabin, carved into the slope itself, a strange structure catches the eye of passing riders. A shed built backward, dug into the earth rather than standing upon it. The neighbors called it foolish. A widow's desperation. A grave beneath a home. But by February, when the valley was drowning in frozen rain and every woodpile had turned to rot, that same shed became the most envied structure in 3 counties. Today, you'll discover why the stupidest building decision became the blueprint for survival, and why the woman who built it understood something about heat, moisture, and earth that the experts had forgotten. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this pioneer trick might work in your climate too. Let's begin. Margaret Thorne was 43 years old when her husband died in a logging accident near Missoula. She inherited 160 acres of rocky hillside, a timber frame cabin with a stone chimney, and a single winter's worth of split firewood stacked outside under a canvas tarp. She also inherited a problem that most settlers never solved: wetwood. Every autumn, the Bitterroot Valley turned into a rain-soaked gauntlet. Cold Pacific air slammed into the Rockies, dumping weeks of freezing drizzle before the snow arrived. The wood got soaked. The tarps collected water. The stacks turned heavy, dark, and useless. Wetwood doesn't burn, it smolders. It fills a cabin with smoke, chokes the draft, builds creosote in the chimney, and gives you half the heat for twice the effort. Margaret had watched her husband waste entire mornings splitting damp logs by the stove, trying to dry them enough to keep the fire alive. She refused to repeat that winter. Her cabin sat on a natural slope, the back wall built into the hillside, the front perched on stone piers. The earth rose behind it like a protective shoulder. She needed a root cellar anyway, a place to keep potatoes and carrots from freezing. So in late September, she started digging. 8 feet into the hillside, straight back from the cabin's rear foundation. But instead of stopping at a small cellar, she kept going. She dug wider, lined the walls with stacked fieldstone, built a timber frame roof that doubled as support for the cabin floor above, created a long, dry corridor that ran the width of her home. It wasn't a root cellar anymore. It was a wood shed, underground, beneath her cabin, connected to the foundation, but entered from outside through a low stone doorway. The concept was accidental. She was solving 2 problems at once and stumbled into a third solution she hadn't planned for. Dry storage, stable temperature, and structural reinforcement, all in one space. The technical logic was simple, though she couldn't have named the physics. The Earth stays between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, far below the surface. Dig deep enough, and you escape the freeze-thaw cycle. The cabin's warmth above radiates down through the floorboards, keeping the shed air dry and just warm enough to prevent condensation. Dry air rises naturally into the cabin through tiny gaps in the planking, creating a slow, passive circulation. No rain, no snow, no wind, no moisture. She stacked her firewood in that shed in neat rows, bark side up, with air gaps between each piece. The logs sat on flat stones to keep them off the dirt floor. The whole structure breathed, slow and steady, like a lung. By mid-October, her firewood was drier than it had been in August. The neighbors noticed immediately. Samuel Cord, a 46-year-old carpenter from Missouri who'd built half the barns in the valley, stopped his wagon one afternoon to watch Margaret working. She was hauling stones up from the creek, laying them into the shed walls with mud mortar. He didn't say anything at first, just watched. Then he turned to his son and said, loud enough for Margaret to hear, "You're looking at a woman who's building a tomb for her own cabin." Margaret kept working. Other riders passed by over the next few weeks. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. A few stopped to offer advice she didn't ask for. "You're putting your home on top of rotting wood, ma'am. That shed's going to fill with groundwater and freeze solid. Earth and timber don't mix. You'll have rot in 6 months and collapse in a year. It looks like a damn grave under your house." Margaret Thorne wasn't a talker. She'd learned early that men in the valley didn't listen to widows, especially widows who did things differently. So she didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just kept stacking stones, kept digging, kept framing. The mockery was soft, almost polite, but it was constant. At the trading post, someone asked if she was still digging her own basement. At Sunday gatherings, women whispered that desperation makes people do strange things. Even the pastor, kindly, suggested she hire a man to fix the situation before winter. The judgment wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was condescending. Pity dressed up as concern. Samuel Cord came back in early November, just as Margaret was finishing the timber roof. He walked the perimeter of the shed, crouched to look inside, ran his hand along the stone walls. Then he stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees, and looked her in the eye. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you've wasted a month of good weather on a structure that'll cost you your foundation. I've built in 4 territories. I know what I'm talking about. That shed will trap moisture, rot your floor joists, and when the ground freezes, it'll heave and crack your cabin walls." He wasn't angry. He wasn't mean. He was certain. Margaret looked at him and said only, "We'll see." Cord shook his head, climbed back on his wagon, and left. Traditional wisdom in Montana Territory was clear. Keep firewood away from the earth. Stack it high, cover it loose, let air move through it. Never bury it. Never enclose it. Rot came from contact with soil. Everyone knew that. Margaret Thorne had just built the opposite, and everyone was waiting for her to fail. November of 1883 arrived early and cruel. The first storm hit on the 8th, a low, slow-moving system that brought freezing rain instead of snow. The temperature hovered between 28 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 straight days. Cold enough to freeze, but warm enough to melt. The rain fell heavy and constant, soaking into everything. Then the temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Everything that had melted froze solid. Then it warmed again. Then it froze again. For 5 weeks, the Bitterroot Valley was trapped in a wet, freezing cycle that destroyed every outdoor woodpile in the region. Tarps collapsed under the weight of ice. Canvas coverings tore in the wind. Stacks of firewood, carefully built in September, turned into solid blocks of frozen timber by December. Even the wood stored under overhangs and lean-tos absorbed moisture from the air. The relative humidity stayed near saturation for weeks, and the freeze-thaw cycle drove water deep into the grain. Families were burning logs at 30 to 40% moisture content, nearly twice the threshold for efficient combustion. The wood didn't burn, it steamed. Cabins filled with acrid smoke. Fires sputtered and died. Creosote built up in chimneys at dangerous rates, black and sticky, waiting for a spark to ignite it into a chimney fire. People were cold, dangerously cold. Samuel Cord's family burned through their December wood supply by mid-November. His son spent every morning splitting half-frozen logs and stacking them near the stove, trying to dry them enough to catch flame. It took an hour to get a decent fire going. The heat output was miserable, half of what drywood would produce. Other families fared worse. Some resorted to burning fence posts. Others mixed coal dust with wet wood, creating a choking, toxic smoke. A few cabins saw chimney fires, fast, roaring blazes that scorched flues and terrified children. But through it all, one chimney in the valley kept burning clean. Margaret Thorne's smoke rose straight and pale, the sign of a hot, efficient fire. Her cabin glowed warm at night. She wasn't outside every morning struggling with frozen tarps or hauling half-rotted logs. At first, no one noticed. Then a neighbor's wife, Anna Pritchard, desperate and freezing, walked the 1.5 miles to Margaret's cabin in early December. She knocked. Margaret answered. Anna was shivering, her hands raw. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice tight, "I'll pay you for dry wood. Name your price. My children are sleeping by the stove because the bedrooms won't hold heat." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Come inside," she said. She led Anna through the cabin, to the back wall, and opened a small interior hatch she'd built into the floor, a secondary access point to the shed below. Warm air rose up from the opening, carrying the scent of dry pine. "Take what you need," Margaret said. "No charge." Anna stared down into the shed. Her eyes widened. "Stay with me," because what she found inside that shed humiliated every critic in the valley. Anna Pritchard climbed down the ladder into Margaret Thorne's underground wood shed and stopped halfway, frozen in disbelief. The air was warm. Not hot, just warm. Maybe 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Dry. Still. The kind of air that doesn't bite your lungs or cling to your skin. The firewood was stacked floor to ceiling along both walls, each log pale and clean, the bark tight and unswollen. Anna reached out and touched a piece of split pine. It was light, bone-dry. When she tapped two pieces together, they rang like bells. She looked up at Margaret, still standing at the hatch above. "How?" she asked. Margaret didn't answer with theory. She just said, "The earth doesn't freeze down here. The cabin keeps it warm enough. The air stays dry." Anna loaded her arms with wood and climbed back up. Before she left, she asked if she could bring her husband to see it. Margaret nodded. By the end of the week, 6 families had visited Margaret's cabin. Word spread faster than the cold. Samuel Cord came too. He didn't ask permission. He just showed up one afternoon, knocked, and said, "I'd like to see this shed, Mrs. Thorne." She let him in. Cord descended into the shed with a skeptic's caution, expecting to find rot, dampness, mold, or structural failure. Instead, he found engineering. The stone walls were dry to the touch. No condensation. No frost, no water seeping from the earth. The timber roof beams showed no sagging, no rot, no insect damage. The floor was packed dirt, but it wasn't muddy. It was firm, almost dusty. He pulled a log from the stack and examined it. Split clean, no dark water stains, no soft spots. He struck it with his knuckle. It sounded solid, dense, dry. He'd been burning wet wood for 6 weeks. This was perfect firewood. Cord didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret and asked, "What's the moisture content?" Margaret didn't own a meter, but she knew by feel and sound. 12 to 15%, she said. Maybe less. Cord's firewood, back at his cabin, was sitting at 35 to 40%. Wetwood produces half the heat of dry wood and burns twice as slow. Not because it's efficient, but because it's fighting its own water content. For every BTU spent evaporating moisture, that's 1 less BTU heating the cabin. The math was brutal. Margaret was burning 40% less wood than her neighbors for the same amount of heat. Her fires burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. A single load of wood in her stove lasted 6 hours. Cord's fires barely lasted 3. But the real proof wasn't just efficiency, it was consistency. Outside, the temperature swung wildly. 20 degrees one night, 35 the next day, back down to 15. The freeze-thaw cycle destroyed everything exposed to it. Inside Margaret's shed, the temperature stayed steady. 48 degrees. Every day, every night. The earth acted as a thermal battery, absorbing the cabin's warmth from above and radiating it back slowly, evenly, endlessly. No rain touched the wood. No wind dried it too fast and cracked it. No snow melted into the grain. The wood aged perfectly, losing moisture without losing integrity. Cord ran his hand along the stone wall one more time, then climbed back up the ladder. He stood in Margaret's cabin, brushed the dust off his sleeves, and said quietly, "I was wrong." Margaret didn't gloat. She just nodded. Anna Pritchard, who'd been standing nearby, spoke up. "How many cords do you think she saved this winter, Mr. Cord?" Cord did the math in his head. If she's burning 40% less wood, and we're only halfway through winter, she'll save 2 full cords by spring. Maybe more. 2 cords of firewood. 8 feet long, 4 feet high, 4 feet wide. 16 cubic feet of labor, sweat, and time. 2 cords represented a month of a man's work in the woods. Margaret Thorne had saved a month of her life by digging a hole in the ground. Spring came late to the Bitterroot Valley in 1884, but when it arrived, the landscape had changed. Samuel Cord was the first to break ground. In early April, while snow still clung to the high ridges, he started digging into the hillside behind his own cabin. His son worked beside him, moving stones, cutting timber, laying out a design that looked suspiciously familiar. He didn't copy Margaret's shed exactly. He adapted it. His cabin sat on flatter ground, so he dug deeper, nearly 10 feet, and built stone steps down from exterior door. He added ventilation gaps at the roofline and pitched the interior floor slightly for drainage, just in case. But the principle was identical: earth insulation, stable temperature, passive drying. By June, Samuel Cord had a wood shed beneath his cabin. He wasn't alone. Within 20 miles of Margaret's homestead, 7 families began construction on what they started calling hillside cellars, or thorn sheds. Some built them fully underground. Others carved half-dugouts into slopes, leaving one wall exposed for easier access. A few combined the design with root cellars, creating dual-purpose storage that kept both firewood and food dry year-round. The variations were practical, not arbitrary. Families on steep slopes dug straight back like Margaret had. Families on gentle hills built L-shaped dugouts with side entries. One rancher near Stevensville excavated beneath his barn and stored both wood and tools in the same dry, stable space. The design spread because it worked and because it was cheap. No expensive lumber, no metal roofing, just stone, earth, timber, and labor. A man with a shovel in 2 weeks could build a structure that would outlast most above-ground sheds and perform better in every measurable way. Margaret didn't charge for consultations, but people came to her anyway. They asked about drainage, about ventilation, about how deep to dig and how thick to build the walls. She answered every question plainly, without ceremony. One afternoon in late May, a miner from the northern hills arrived with his brother. They'd heard about the shed from a trading post clerk and wanted to see if the concept would work for tool storage. Margaret showed them the structure, explained the temperature stability, and suggested they add a second access point from inside their cabin for winter convenience. They built 2 sheds, one for tools, one for wood, and reported back that both stayed dry through the following winter. By the autumn of 1884, the hillside wood cellar had become a recognized design in the valley. It wasn't revolutionary. It was common sense applied correctly. But common sense, Margaret had learned, isn't common until someone proves it works. Samuel Cord never apologized in words, but he apologized in action. He told other builders about Margaret's design. He recommended her methods to newcomers. And when a young couple from Ohio asked him for advice on surviving their first Montana winter, he walked them to Margaret's cabin and said, simply, learn from her. Margaret Thorne became, quietly, the valley's informal authority on passive storage and earth shelter design. She didn't seek the role. She didn't advertise. But when people needed real answers, they came to her. And the technique kept spreading. By 1887, hillside wood cellars appeared in Montana Territory homestead guides as a recommended practice for families building on sloped land. The design showed up in settlers' journals, sketched in margins with notes like "keeps wood dry all winter" and "saved us 2 cords last year." It wasn't Margaret's invention. Earth-sheltered storage was as old as civilization itself. But she'd remembered what the valley had forgotten, that the earth is the oldest insulator, that gravity moves water and heat moves air, and that sometimes the simplest solution is the one no one's willing to try. The useless shed had become standard practice. And the woman who'd been mocked for digging a grave had taught a territory how to stay warm. Margaret Thorne lived in that cabin for another 19 years. The shed never collapsed. The floor joists never rotted. The foundation never cracked. In the winter of 1889, when temperatures dropped to 18 degrees below zero for a week straight, her firewood stayed dry and her cabin stayed warm, while neighbors burned through emergency reserves and prayed for a thaw. She wasn't a genius. She wasn't an engineer. She was a widow who couldn't afford to waste a single log, so she thought about the problem differently than everyone else. The lesson wasn't about construction. It was about observation. Margaret had noticed that root cellars stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. She'd noticed that earth doesn't freeze below a certain depth. She'd noticed that warm air rises and dry air moves toward moisture. She didn't need a textbook to tell her these things. She just needed to pay attention. The valley had been so fixated on keeping wood away from the earth that they'd forgotten the earth itself was the solution. They'd fought moisture with tarps and prayers, when they should have been working with physics instead. Passive storage, thermal mass, earth-sheltered design. These are modern concepts. They're ancient solutions that worked when survival depended on them. and they still work now. Margaret Thorne didn't invent the hillside with cellar. She rediscovered it, and in doing so, she reminded an entire community that wisdom isn't always loud, and innovation isn't always complicated. Sometimes the best answer is the one that's been buried under our feet the whole time. The loudest critic is often just someone who hasn't been cold enough yet. Samuel Cord learned that. The Valley learned that. And Margaret Thorne proved it without saying a word. She just kept stacking stones, kept digging, kept trusting what the earth had always known. And when winter came, she stayed warm. If you made it this far, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Hit that subscribe button for a new frontier survival technique every week. Real history, real engineering, zero fluff. Because the pioneers weren't guessing. They were solving problems that could kill them. And we've forgotten most of what they learned. Let's remember it together. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.